Big ID is the leading data security posture management or DSPM vendor, and they do DSPM differently. DSPM centers around risk management and how organizations need to assess, understand, identify, and remediate data security risks across their data. Big ID seamlessly integrates with your existing tech stack and helps you uncover dark data, identify and reduce risk, take action through remediation, and scale your data security strategy. Big ID is reshaping the future of data security, and CB Insights named Big ID the leader in DSPM and the most disruptive cybersecurity software in the space. Visit securityweekly.com/Big ID to learn more. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. This interview is sponsored by ThreatLocker. Rob Allen joins us today to talk about how we can stop zero-day threats without AI or superhuman speed. Rob is the Chief Product Officer at ThreatLocker. He has a technical background and spent a large portion of his 2 decades of experience at an Irish-based MSP. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Every time somebody reads that out, I'm like, it's actually a little bit more than 2 decades now. It's probably closer to 2.5 decades, pushing 3 decades to be, if I'm brutally honest.
We don't count around here. We just say a while.
Oh, okay. We'll settle on an even quarter of a century. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. and reading your bio, when I read Rob Allen has been at the coalface, I was like, okay, Rob might be Irish. Rob might be very Irish. That we might say we've been in the trenches, but even though none of us,
we don't do trenches in Ireland. We definitely don't do trenches in Ireland. So yeah, and again, that part of my bio may need updating slightly. So thanks for the reminder. But yeah,
I think that's a reference to maybe shoveling coal into a furnace.
I think so. I've not actually.
I've never been in a trench either.
Well, that's a relief. That makes 2 of us, Adrian.
Yeah, I'm not old enough to have served in World War
I. Likewise. Just about.
All right. So yeah, looking forward to this conversation here because I feel like there are many areas in cybersecurity where we tend to get tunnel vision. And I work with a lot of enterprises. I do a lot of advisory calls with defenders, with enterprises, with practitioners on vulnerability management. And, one of the key things we often talk about is just the speed discrepancy. I think I've seen that the average for attackers or just the general industry researchers to create working proof of concept for exploits is less than 5 days now. Whether it's an attack or, somebody putting something up on GitHub, wherever that exploit comes from, a Metasploit module. Whereas the average time to get a critical patch in place is 2 weeks. And in our news segment, one of the items we're talking about is a 11-year-old Cisco ASA vulnerability that's making the rounds. And apparently people are getting a lot of mileage out of that, as old as that is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the people tend to forget. So there's the part after a vulnerability becomes known, and then the time it takes to get a patch developed and get that patch deployed to production. But there's also the unknown amount of time that the vulnerability existed, which, as you just pointed out, in one case was upwards of 11 years. So that's 11 years of a vulnerability being available to be exploited. I mean, I tend to have a pretty simplistic view on this, which is just to assume everything is full of holes. Assume there are bugs in all the software that you use every single day. We're talking, I'm on Chrome right now. I have no doubt that this version of Chrome that I'm running has got some doozies of bugs in it. But rather than rushing and trying to keep things and patching things as soon as patches become released, if you work on the principle that yes, these things are full of bugs, what's the next thing that happens if these bugs are exploited? And typically the next thing that will happen is something will run, for the most part. So if it's remote execution, it's going to be something will run. It's, it might be it calls PowerShell, and PowerShell does some stuff. But again, it's if you focus less on the trying to patch the things that are known about and focus more on the, avoiding the next thing from being able to happen, I think people will be in much better position.
Right, very true. Yeah, there will be vulnerabilities that we don't know about that exploits will exist for before disclosure occurs, right? There will be, you know, probably the average ransomware crew isn't burning a 0 day on just a, random target, but yeah, then there's just things that get overlooked, right?
Mm,
There's, I didn't realize that server was still sitting out there and connected to our network. So yeah, assuming that at least that initial foothold of compromise is going to happen, I think is kind of a healthy place to start the discussion. And it doesn't mean we don't still try and patch quickly,
mm,
if we have the ability to, but I kind of think of patching as just one option for mitigating the risk of that vulnerability, right? Then
absolutely.
there are other things we can do. I remember with Log4j, when Log4Shell hit, the people who had the easiest time of it had very restrictive outbound policies. Their servers couldn't browse the entire public internet, for example. And with tight outbound policies, it didn't matter if the exploit made it to that log4j instance if it couldn't then create a shell
Yeah.
back out, right?
No, absolutely. And again, look, it's all about layers, realistically. So as I said, you can think about the execution part of things, which is the things that are running. You can think about the living off the land, which, as I said, it's the likes of PowerShells and run DLLs, etc., being weaponized and misused. But as you correctly pointed out, controlling network traffic is a really simple and a really basic way to alleviate a lot of these risks. It's something that we've been talking to a lot of customers about recently and putting a big push on recently is just network control, controlling not only inbound connections, because obviously inbound connections are really important, but also those outbound connections as well. So if a server doesn't need to talk to the entire internet, then why would you let that server talk to the entire internet? As I said, apart from alleviating vulnerabilities, you're also going to stop things like data exfiltration. If
Mm-hmm.
a server only needs to talk to Microsoft, then why would you let the server talk to anywhere except Microsoft? So
Exactly.
that principle, I mean, fundamentally what we're talking about here is the principle of deny by default, permit by exception. And that is basically what we do in all aspects of ThreatLocker. The overriding principle is that of deny by default and permit by exception. So whether it be, as I said, what can run, what things can do, what things have access to what data, or what connections can happen network wise, the same principle, which is deny by default, permit by exception. Permit by exception part is really important, by the way, because people hear deny by default and they go, oh my God, that sounds really scary. But the permit by exception is what lets you run your business. It's what lets your users do what they need to do. So that is important as well. But as I said, the deny by default is the key.
Yeah, and just in terms of numbers, like just looking at the whole thing as a numbers game, I think it makes more sense. Like there are over 200,000 vulnerabilities out there, right? Maybe 5% or less than 5% of those are exploitable. And then there's the time component in there as well. But if you think about you've probably worked a lot of breaches. I study a lot of breaches. And how companies fail and things like that. And honestly, when I look at the average ransomware campaign, it just looks like a mediocre pen test from 10 years ago. The vast majority of them, they're using the same tools, the same techniques. And this numbers game comes down to, well, now there's like a dozen TTPs that we just see over and over and over.
Mm.
I'd much rather worry about those dozen things than the 200,000 vulnerabilities or even 5% of that 200,000, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember the number. I did have a number in my head as to the number of CVEs per year. I think it's somewhere in the
It's
region
like
of,
23,000, something
yeah,
like
it,
that.
it,
Yeah,
it
it's a
floats
lot.
around 3,000 constantly. And again, just keeping on top of that and trying to figure out what's important, what's relevant, what's
Mhm.
exploitable is it's not easy.
Yeah, I think
Um,
CISA Kev might be up to like 1,500 at this point. The known
really.
exploited vulnerabilities list. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, again, keeping on top of that is not, I'm not going to say it's not practical, but it's not easy. But again, to what end? Because yes, these are the known about vulnerabilities. What about the unknown about vulnerabilities as well? I mean, to your point about the ransomware gangs being like, pretty standard pen tests. What I would say we've seen quite recently, well, actually, let me step back for a second. So if you'd asked me 6 months ago about what your typical ransomware gang or operator is like, I would have said really fundamentally they're lazy. They're looking for low-hanging fruit. They're looking for environments that are friendly, environments that are not going to get in their way, that are not going to stop them doing from what they want to do. And if they run against any roadblocks, if they find something that makes their life too difficult, they basically just pivot and move to another target. And we've seen examples of this in practice. Some of the gangs more recently, I would describe them as being far more focused, far more determined than they once were. Now, I don't know what the reason for this is. I have a suspicion I might know, which is I think in a lot of cases they're basically paying for access to environments. So they're not going out trying to figure out ways to get into X hospital. What they're doing is they're going to a data broker and they're buying access to X hospital.
They've already spent the money.
Correct. So
There's
once they've
already an
made that
investment.
investment, there, and again, this is an assumption or a presumption that I have. But once they've made that investment, I think in a lot of cases they're going to get something out of it. They're not just going to say, it's too much hassle and I'm going to move on to another target if they can't actually do what they need to do. Again, we've seen examples of this. We've seen things like, we've seen occasions where they will attack, say, Hyper-V servers, for example. And if they find a VM, like a server VM running on a Hyper-V server and it's running, this security software and that security software and the other security software, all they're going to do is they're going to shut down that VM, mount the VHD, delete all the security software, and then boot it up again, minus the security software. Now, that's a new technique. That's a new tactic that we've seen in the wild. And I'd never seen that before in my, too many years in the industry and my 4 years now with ThreatLocker. I'd never seen that particular approach being taken. I have seen it being taken quite recently by one particular ransomware gang, and it's a ransomware gang that are quite active right now. But that's just one example of how they are more determined than ever, that if they get in, they will find a way to get you. Again, all the more reason to make it very difficult for them to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is, so kind of running back to, it still sounds like some of the attackers, some of the adversaries, will kind of drop and run as soon as they start encountering any friction there. But knowing that this criminal industry is kind of divided up, you do have the initial access vendor. You've got the info stealer ransomware that will just scoop up credentials and things like that. Sell a Slack key, to X organization for $20, and you're not that invested with a $20 Slack key. Maybe you spend a couple hours on it, and if you're not getting anywhere, you move on. But I imagine active access, like a rat or something like that already installed somewhere on the internal network, probably worth more than $20.
Absolutely. Or domain admin credentials too. In a lot of cases, it's based on the size of the organization. It's based on the revenue of the organization. Funnily enough, one of the things that they look for if they do get access, one of the first things they look for is things like financial documents, bank statements. They want to see how much money you've got in the bank because they want to figure out how much they're going to ransom you for. It seems that the sweet spot is somewhere around 30% of your available cash. So they're not going to ask for, if you've got $1 million in the bank, they're not going to ask you for $1 million because they know you're not going to pay. But equally, they don't want to ask for too little. So around the 30% mark seems to be their preferred target right now. They also, incidentally, will look for insurance documentation. So again, it's one of the first things they're going to look for.
They want to know that policy payout.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you have cyber insurance? How much will your cyber insurance pay in the event of a breach? So again, information for them to decide how much they actually want to ask for. So it's quite interesting, but obviously quite devious as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more. I mentioned a dozen, maybe it's more than that. I recently read a Scientia Institute did a meta-analysis of ransomware reports from all sorts of companies who have done reports on specific ransomware actors on the TTPs that they use, and they map them to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I forget exactly what the percentage is, but kind of the takeaway was the MITRE ATT&CK framework is an encyclopedia of everything that's possible, not something you should systematically go through and have a detection or a defense or a protection for every single item in there, because you'd be wasting a bunch of your time on things that threat actors never use. They could use it one day, but often there's just not incentive. There's an easier way to do it. That's convoluted. We're not going to do the Hollywood hacking. We're going to choose the $5 wrench and
one thing that I always find amazing is the prevalence of use or misuse of, I suppose, otherwise good tools, what I describe as otherwise good tools as part of these attacks. So you mentioned rats. I mean, why use a rat if you can use AnyDesk? I mean, AnyDesk is basically the remote access tool of choice for these ransomware gangs. And the other thing that we've seen quite a bit of is if an environment gets compromised, very often the first thing that will run after it's been compromised is an IP scanner. So whether it be advanced IP scanner or NetMap or whatever the case may be, they're going to run some sort of network scanning tool to see what else is out there on the network. Now, again, what do AnyDesk and Nmap have in common? I mean, neither of them are bad applications. Neither of them are something that you would ordinarily go, oh my God, that's running, I better check it out. But based on the experience that we've seen of breaches and attacks, both successful and unsuccessful in a lot of cases, because again, I would like to think that we're responsible for a lot of unsuccessful attacks as well. But as I said, very often the first thing that's going to run is they're going to try and run AnyDesk because they want to give themselves persistent access, and they're going to try and run Nmap to see what else is out in the network. Again, as I said, both not bad applications, but there's other things like that. I mean, again, another huge indicator of compromise is event logs getting cleared. Somebody clears event logs on a server, it's very unlikely to be a tech who's working that server. You know what I mean? So you should put a lot of focus on, hang on a second, I've just seen a server with the event logs being cleared. But yeah, as you said, there's a relatively small number. You're probably talking in the dozens of real indicators of compromise. And especially if you see, if one thing happens like that, it could be important, it might not be. If you see two or three of those things happening in a relatively short period of time, that's a pretty big red flag. You know what I mean? So somebody, AnyDesk runs on the machine, and then you see an IP scanner running shortly afterwards, and then, the next day the event logs getting cleared. That's like, okay, this is an environment under attack, most likely.
Well, and if you, at the corporate level, if you own TeamViewer and you've standardized on TeamViewer, then anytime AnyDesk pops up in your environment, you should probably treat it as if it's a malware detection, right?
Absolutely. And look, it works both ways. I mean, I had a really interesting conversation with a customer some time ago about, at the time, they basically wanted to tell us all the bad stuff that was in their environment. And good and bad is not, we're more about control, generally speaking. We do have detection capabilities, but at that time we were more about control. So instead of looking for bad things specifically, I said, hang on a second, I'm going to look for how many remote access tools you've got running on your machines. There was six different remote access tools running in this relatively small environment of a couple of hundred machines. They had AnyDesk, they had TeamViewer, they'd Go to Assist, they'd Log Me In, they had...
I couldn't even name half a dozen off the top of my head.
Oh yeah, no, I found them, and some of them were actually quite interesting. So like there was an IT company, an MSP, that was looking after them. So they had both the current MSP's remote access software and RMM agent running on their machines, but they also had the previous MSP's RMM and remote access tool running on a couple of their machines. But the really interesting thing in that case was that almost 20% of their machines were running TeamViewer. Now, neither the company that looked after them or the company themselves used TeamViewer. So there was no good reason for TeamViewer to be on 20% of their machines. And we all know how it happens, which is at some point in the distant past, some third party said, you've got a problem with that software. Let me get into your machine. I'll fix it. Install TeamViewer. It gets installed and it sits there forever. as a potential way into that network. And the problem with something like that installed is it's unmanaged. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen, you open TeamViewer, it's going to ask you to log in, and somebody opens TeamViewer and it says log in. You go, well, I don't have a login for this. Let me create one. They put in their same username and password, that our same email address and password that they've used on 15 other websites, and then all of a sudden one of those 15 other websites gets compromised, and then they're into the TeamViewer on that machine. I mean, one of my, and favorite is a terrible word to use in the context of cyber attacks, but one of my favorite cyber attacks over the last number of years was one on a water treatment facility here in Florida. And it involved and I always like to think of this as Homer Simpson sitting at the controls of the power plant, but it basically involved a guy sitting there watching the controls for chemicals being adjusted in front of him. So he's literally sitting there and he can see that this really dangerous chemical level is going up and up and up. Now, it was described in the press as an advanced cyber attack, but it was basically just TeamViewer. Somebody got into TeamViewer in that machine and started mucking around with the chemicals. It was no more advanced than that.
And actually, the FBI finished their investigation, and it was just jumping at shadows. There was never an attacker. It was another employee from home. So,
but
the whole thing,
TeamViewer was the extent of the breach, so to speak. But as I said, that was just a really interesting example. And so many organizations, I mean, one of the biggest problems a lot of organizations have, they've no idea what's out there. They don't know what's running on their machines. So how many of your machines are running TeamViewer? How many active connections have you got to Russian IP addresses? How many people are looking at TikTok on your machines? I mean, we did some work with a government entity, and we found, as well as active connections to Russian IP addresses and remote access tools running on lots of machines, we also saw something like 57 or 58 machines with connections to TikTok. Now, as your more observant viewers will notice, I mean, I'm not American, I'm not from here, but one thing I'm pretty sure about is that US government machines should not be communicating with TikTok. But they were. But the point is, the organization had no idea. They didn't know all these tools were installed and running. They didn't know all this software is there. They didn't know people were using TikTok on their work computers. So
I think it's a common experience for a consultant. I always found it unnerving that whether I was doing, I was a PCI QSA and a penetration tester, sometimes at the same time for the same client, which is a different discussion that probably shouldn't have happened. But I always found it unnerving after a 20-hour, 40-hour consulting job for someone that I would then know the network better than anyone there, because it's nobody's job to really know the network, particularly with data flows. Having a data flow diagram of how payments work in your organization is a requirement that doesn't really have a requirement number in PCI. It's just one of those baseline things you need for all the requirements. And I often found you had to interview half a dozen people and then put Wireshark on half a dozen machines to actually validate, because you'd find the way people thought things were working and the way they were actually working different. It was a mix of firsthand experience and something somebody told me for each of these people. And it turned into a game of telephone over the years where, oh yeah, I forgot we upgraded this one component, and that one could be, actually that server doesn't even need to be running anymore.
Yeah. Or if that computer isn't turned on, my thing doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. But we don't know why, right?
Yeah.
So we're afraid to turn it off or to patch it or to reboot it or to do anything with it, which is a horrible way to run infrastructure.
Oh no, absolutely. But look, as I said, visibility is the start. I mean, to your point about data flows, I mean, I can give you really simple basic examples. I mean, again, back in my previous life working for the other company, I had customers coming to me saying, well, look, we let this guy go yesterday and I think he might have stolen data. I think he might have, taken our contact list or whatever the case may be. Can you tell me, did he? And I mean, realistically, the only answer I could give was, look, if you can give me a time machine that I could go back in time to before you actually let him go, then I'll turn on advanced auditing and logging in Windows, and then I might be able to answer your question. But again, it's one of the things that ThreatLocker, the solution, does out of the box is we log all reads,
Well,
writes, copies, moves, everything. So you can actually see where data is going, what's happening, who's accessing what, how many times. And it's really useful even from a detection perspective. I mean, a really simple example is, our CFO, his typical workflow or his daily morning might be opening 5 spreadsheets, for example. Now, if we see him reading or writing 500 files in a period of 5 minutes, again, that's a pretty good indicator of compromise. And one of the things we can do with our solution, because it's so multifaceted, is we can say, well, look, if we can see 500 reads or writes from a user in a short period of time, I'm going to lock storage. I'm going to block write access to that storage location, so they're not going to be able to do anything like that. So there's a lot of stuff around data and data flow. And the other thing that organizations really should look at doing is, if you think about your traditional model to storage and access control, it's typically it's user based. So as Rob has access to a data location, the problem with that is, once Rob has access to a data location, everything Rob runs has access to that data location as well. So whether it be, Office or Angry Birds or a piece of ransomware. And again, that's one of the reasons why ransomware is as prevalent, as successful as it is. So going back to what we mentioned earlier on about the idea of deny by default, what we say is, well, look, not every program that I run on my machine needs to access my data. That finance share over there. So if only Excel and a line of business application and 2 other programs need to access that line of business application's data, or that data location, then why would I let anything other than those 4 or 5 programs access that location? So again, comes back around to the idea of deny by default, permit by exception. So block every program for accessing my finance share except the 4 or 5 that need access. So you're going to reduce the potential for data exfiltration, number one, but you're also going to reduce the potential for damage if something bad does get into the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder, is that a lot of work to set up, though? You find out, oh, this piece of PowerShell actually does need access to that data. Every time, I'm doing X, Y, or Z, it needs to go out and do that. I imagine you do find some exceptions there, and that's always been kind of the question around allow listing, right? Like this kind of reduce privileges to the absolute least needed everywhere is the solution for everything in security. But the reason we don't all do it, like I remember the first time I talked to a micro virtualization startup back in 2012, 2013, I think. They pitched it to me and I was like, okay, so you're telling me I'm going from 8 firewall rule sets to 8,000 plus firewall. How am I going to manage that? Right.
Yeah.
Like, how am I going to determine what that should be on every host? And so maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, how do we tackle, how do we avoid configuration hell here?
So the first thing I'd say is the idea that allow listing is difficult or a heavy lift is not unreasonable based on some of the available solutions. So as an example, I spoke to quite a large organization in the UK who'd spent, and this is genuine and not an exaggeration, 4 years on a project trying to implement allow listing. 4 years. Another organization in the Middle East, healthcare provider in the Middle East, who'd spent, and a team of 10 people had spent 2 years trying to implement just allow listing, not any of the other fun stuff I mentioned, the storage or network control or anything, just allow listing. And they gave up. They'd given up in frustration because it was just too difficult. But what I would say, in most environments, in my experience, the vast majority of users do the same things in the same way with the same software every single day. They typically, they'll use Office, they'll use browsers, they'll use video conferencing tools like Teams and Zoom. They probably use a line of business application or 2. I mean, even me, who's a fairly advanced user, I use maybe 7 or 8 programs on a daily basis.
Same here.
So the key is to make sure those 7 or 8 programs continue to run, even if other things are being allowed, or even if other things are being denied. Now, as I said, that's probably 98% of users. You do have the exceptions. You do have the more difficult or complicated or slightly heavier lifting ones, things like developers. Developers are always going to be a challenge when you talk about something like allow listing, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just needs a
and that
little
doesn't
bit
mean
more.
you don't do it on the other 98% of employees.
This is exactly the point. This is exactly the point, because again, it's probably realistically the 98% are the ones who are probably going to get hit because of the less, savvy, shall we say. But yeah, as I said, it can be equally accomplished for developers, again, with a little thought. And one of the, I suppose, benefits to, and again, look, I've got an entire team of 60 developers outside my office here, so I'm not going to say anything negative about them. But one of the great things about using a tool like ThreatLocker is you can actually corral them into working in the way you want them to work, if you understand me. So, I mean, I've seen environments where there's like 10 developers, for example, and each of the 10 developers keeps their source code in a different location. Each of them does things differently. So one guy's got
different ID.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've got my stuff in CDev, and he's got it in CDev root, and I've got it in my OneDrive folder, and somebody else has got it on a server over there, and the stuff is everywhere, and there's no control over it. So one of the benefits to what we do is you can say, right, if you compile your code in your OneDrive dev folder, it's going to be fine. You're going to have no problems running it, okay? If you don't do that, then you're going to be stuck. It can actually encourage them to do things in the way you want them. Absolutely. You can herd the dev cats, so to speak. But yeah, as I said, they are an example of where it's a little bit trickier. But for the vast majority of users who use the same software in the same way every single day, fundamentally what we're talking about is putting boundaries around that, putting guardrails around that, and saying, look, you operate within these boundaries, and you're not even going to know we're here. We're not going to get in your way. Now, if you step outside those boundaries and try and run a remote access tool or a coupon clipper from China, then absolutely we're going to stop that from running. But it just puts control into the hands of the administrators.
Chinese coupon clippers.
Coopert is a Chinese coupon clipper.
Yeah.
I know that because we've got a product research department outside my office here as well. And their job, believe it or not, is to research every single piece of software. Every piece of software. Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's going to take them a while, but one of the things that I've become aware of is that Cooper, the coupon clipper, is made by a Chinese company. I mean, 7-Zip is made by, is Russian, Now, would that influence your decision as to whether to run it or not? I mean, maybe it depends on the organization, but at least people should be aware of that.
Also have Russian origins. Yeah, and Nginx, the world's most popular web server, has Russian origins, and as does ClickHouse, which is popular open source. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about 7-Zip is 7-Zip has all the characteristics of ransomware, because you can encrypt data with 7-Zip, you can transfer data with 7-Zip, and you can delete data with 7-Zip. I mean, how does that differ from ransomware? In fact, we've seen tools like it. We've seen WinRAR being used as part of ransomware attacks. And again, it's maybe it's a sign of desperation that they can't run ransomware. They can't do what they want to do. They can't use PowerShell to exfiltrate data. Oh, hang on a second. I can see WinRAR is on this machine. Let me see if I can use that instead. But yeah, they have all the characteristics of ransomware.
Yeah. Good stuff. Rob, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
You're very welcome.
I think this episode was very informative. Make sure you visit securityweekly.com/threatlocker to learn more. And we'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.